Hello everybody, and welcome to Jewish Renaissance. If you don't already know me, my name is Aviva, and I'm JR's Executive Director. Our new issue, which should have been coming through your doors in the last few days, has many wonderful articles, as always. And I can say that because I don't edit it myself. Rebecca Taylor gets the credit. But I'm really delighted that there are fabulous articles on film, books, theatre, the Sephardi Renaissance, and of course, reflections on the last year, including a specially commissioned essay by the wonderful Israeli novelist Ayelet Goshen. And our passport section travels to Philadelphia, where, in collaboration with the Museum of American Jewish History, we explore the Jewish community there, past and present. We chose Philadelphia, the home of the Declaration of Independence, because of the forthcoming American election. And this Zoom is the first installment of our companion event series, This American Jewish Life. And we'll tell you more about the other events happening at the end of the session. But tonight, or this afternoon in Boston, where I am right now, we're focusing on the election itself. During my visit here this last couple of weeks, I've experienced the anxiety people are feeling and begun to get a real sense of how high the stakes are for the country as a whole, and especially the Jewish community, and let alone, of course, Israel and the wider world. In the last few days, there have been a couple of particularly noteworthy events. The same organisation behind the controversial Project 2025 has released Project Esther, a plan mainly designed by evangelical Christians that states its intention to tackle anti-Semitism and outlines the direction it expects Trump's policy to take should he win. And the Forward, America's leading Jewish news outlet, has just published a poll gauging the response of Jews to events on university campuses since October the 7th last year, and how that's influencing political opinions. So to discuss these issues and many others, I'm going to be joined by three incredible and insightful speakers. So speaking of the Forward, let's start with our first guest, Jodi Rudoren. Jodi became editor-in-chief of the Forward in 2019 after more than 2 decades at the New York Times, including a stint as Jerusalem bureau chief. Under her leadership, journalists at the Forward have won record numbers of Rock Hour Awards from the American Jewish Press Association, as well as prizes from New York's Deadline Club, LA Press Club, the Religion News Association, and the Society for Futures Journalism. And Jodi herself won the RNA's Top Commentary Award in 2022 and was a Deadline Club finalist for her weekly column, Looking Forward. So Jodi, welcome, and we're delighted to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Next, we have Emily Tamkin. Emily is a journalist based in Washington, D.C. I should have said, actually, Jodi is joining us from New Jersey. Emily is a journalist based in Washington, D.C. and the author of, among other things, The Influence of Soros. She previously covered foreign affairs on staff at Foreign Policy and BuzzFeed News. She studied Russian literature and culture at Columbia University and knows the UK quite well because she also studied Russian and East European studies at the University of Oxford. She earned a Fulbright Fellowship and a Henry Boll Scholarship and was a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow in New Delhi, India. You might spot a picture of the Taj Mahal behind her. We've invited Emily to join us tonight, particularly because of one of her books, Bad Jews, which examines the history of Jewish people in America and explores their ever-evolving relationship to the nation's culture and identity, and to each other. I was really interested looking at Bad Jews to see how she examines these last 100 years of American Jewish politics, culture, identities, and arguments, and kind of tracks that evolution of Jewishness throughout American history, exploring lots of those conflicting Jewish positions. America is not one Jewish community or Jewish view, but many. Last but not least, and fighting London traffic, but hopefully joining us very, very soon, is Josh Glancy. So, Josh is going to provide a British perspective. Um, Josh is the editor of the news review at the Sunday Times, so I'm sure many of you have read him. And there he also contributes regular columns and features. But again, we've invited him today for a specific reason, because previously, before returning to London to become the news review editor, he spent 5 years in America, where he was the paper's Washington correspondent, and before moving to Washington, the New York correspondent. And he contributes a regular magazine column on life in the States. And Josh has been nominated 3 times for Feature Writer and Interviewer of the Year at the Press Awards and British Journalism Awards. So you can see it's a really, really an amazing panel. We're grateful to have everyone with us. How we're going to do it is for about the next 25 minutes, I'm going to be in conversation with Jodi and Emily and with Josh when he's able to join us. And then at about 2:30 my time, 7:30 in the UK. I hear is just fantastic.
Hello,
Um,
sorry.
no problem at all. So at about 2:30, we're going to start taking questions from the audience. So what I will say to you now is please, as you're listening, if there are things you're thinking of, things you would like to ask, put a note in the chat to me and we will start that and open up to the floor. I might tell questions depending on our time. We might bring some of you on screen. So this is going to be a conversation, very much so. So to kick it off, we have this election happening, and the three of you have lived and worked through Trump and for some of you Biden presidencies. It's been quite the interesting 8 years. So before we delve into the Jewish stuff, um, how have things changed during those 8 years? And what do you see as the key issues facing the country as we head in to the next few weeks? Um, Maybe we'll start with Jodi.
Sure, thanks. I mean, I'm gonna try to be really quick or do it as like a TLDR, as the kids say, because I want to get to the get deeper in the conversation. But so first of all, I'll say this is at least the third election in a row, and maybe more, in which everybody says this is the most important election of our lifetime. So it seems like, every election is now the most important election of our lifetime. I think the biggest way that the world has changed in terms of an overall thing is, I would say, polarization and the debasement of our discourse. I think that uh, fueled by social media, hate, divisive politics in general. We much, to think about us in like October of 2016 versus now, the biggest difference about like kind of how America feels is that there's more of a sense of the people who are voting different from me are insane, inhuman, awful. I don't understand them at all. Nobody's even trying to understand each other. And there's been a polarization that like of our media spaces as well. There's fewer and fewer spaces like the Forward, frankly, where we actually are even trying to like platform all the opinions across the spectrum. So I would say those are the big kind of climate ways, not climate crisis ways, but just what it feels like here, that it's just really different. The importance, the polarization, and the kind of visible like hate that is just kind of the bile that is like in the air everywhere. I think the other, to get more specific, in a post January 6th world, the issue of democracy takes the question of what does it mean to preserve our American democracy takes a different um, frame and is much more important than it was in any election in my lifetime before. And the other big, huge, humongous change, of course, is the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2 years ago. So I think that, I mean, and I guess you could add, but we're going to get to the Jewish stuff later. The idea that any war, any foreign policy, but that, for our concerns, a war in Israel would like be at all on the radar of issues that people are talking about in an election campaign, high on the radar, is very new. That's like never happened in American history. I mean, I don't know about 1948 and 1967, but that's like not the last 50 years has not been at all a kind of main talking point. So those are the ways I would outline the differences. I'm sure Josh and Emily have some things to add.
Fantastic. Well, Emily, let's see. I mean, Jodi's given this amazing summary, but are there other things that you think the country is feeling or seeing?
I would add two issues on top of democracy and abortion, which I would agree are the two big things that have shifted in our political discourse and political reality. Um, One is how immigration shows up in our political discourse. You have one party saying we need to be tough on the border, and also, you know, Haitian migrants are eating cats and dogs and all of this really like vile conspiracy theories. And the other party is saying those are vile conspiracy theories, and also we need to get tough on the border, right? Like I just think that that our immigration in the political conversation has really hardened over the past 4 and really 8 years. And the other thing that I will say, and I know you said we'll get to the Jewish stuff later, but I actually think you can't separate this out from the others,
Sure.
is that I wrote a piece 4 years ago on anti-Semitism in political discourse. And I, at the time, I grew up in a town with a lot of anti-Semitism. So sort of casually, culturally, it has never surprised me. I have been surprised. I was surprised 4 years ago, and then 4 years later, it's even, I would say the volume's been turned up more, how much anti-Semitism is woven into the political discursive fabric right now. It's tied to democracy and especially immigration. Like you can't talk about our political conversation around immigration without talking about, the idea that these immigrants are being brought in from elsewhere by these elites, by George Soros, et cetera, to remake the country. You can't talk about, oh, they're buying elections without talking about this idea of Soros, media elites, out of touch coastal, et cetera, et cetera. Most people are smart enough to stop short before they say Jews explicitly, but not always. So I just think that the normalization of anti-Semitism and by extension conspiracy and anti-Semitism, by extension conspiracy, and the sort of hateful paranoia in our political reality, that I think represents something. It's not new, but a shift as well, in addition to everything that Jodi said.
Okay. So we are absolutely going to come to anti-Semitism in a moment. And I think that rhetoric that both you and Jodi have talked about, like the pitch that it's gone up to, it's a whole other level. And I wonder, Josh, because obviously through previous elections, you were living in New York and Washington and reporting from America. Now you're based back in London, you're seeing it through a British perspective, but still kind of one of the Sunday Times people on America. What do you see as the differences, and how does that register change kind of impact the way you and your colleagues are reporting the American election this year?
Yeah, it's interesting that so I covered 2016 and 2020, and now I'm watching on from afar, which is quite a different experience, obviously. And some things are much harder to discern. Other things are actually much clearer. One thing that's been very strange about this election is that it's been unbelievably eventful. We've had assassination attempts, we had a debate like no other, we had a presidential candidate drop out, we had another one nominated, and yet apart from a couple of moments, the polls haven't really shifted, which I think speaks to that polarization that Jodi mentioned. Yes, they shifted a little bit around Biden and debate and around Kamala's nomination bounce, but basically everything is kind of solidified and calcified in terms of how most people feel. And so when you stop watching every single poll, as I have recently, you start to see it's kind of plateaued. And relatedly, one thing that's really changed from 2016 to 2020 to now, to my mind, is we've stopped expecting to get a clean result. 2016 was the first time that we saw the kind of election dispute that has now become normalized. Obviously, we saw it massively in 2020. I think most of us now feel that it's more likely than not that there will be some kind of big dispute over this election. It's more likely to come from the Trump side, but not necessarily. So that's quite noticeable. I think from an external perspective, as a kind of friend and ally of America, I think we kind of normalized this chaos now, and we stopped relying on America in some ways. Not stopped relying on American military power or American economic might, but we stopped relying on American reliability. We now see America as our, crazed uncle or something like that. I remember when I arrived in the US in 2016, I'd come straight from Brexit into Trump, which was a fun year. But I compared at the time that it felt like going from a depression to a psychosis. And I think weirdly that kind of still holds. I think Britain is still kind of mired in depression, and America, I'm afraid this probably isn't very politically correct, but it does feel like a form of unwellness has still gripped this country. And for as long as, I don't want to put it all on Trump because it's not, but for as long as he's there, you can't really see it changing.
Jodi, you look like you're about to
Well,
jump in on
no,
that.
I mean, I think it's great to hear Josh's perspective, and I think a few things. I mean, one is like my friend who's the head of the politics desk at the New York Times says, you know, we used to when I covered a campaign in 2004 at the New York Times, like I got married 33 days after the election, but his staff is like going through January. You know what I mean? Like the election is not over on November 5th or whatever, or November 15th. It's like they are planning that they will be in this mode, in this heightened mode, all the way through. And so I think you're totally right on that. I think it's so interesting to think about the crazy uncle. I mean, I definitely think that was certainly how the world increasingly perceived us because during the Trump years, because of that was his approach to foreign policy. I mean, it's like his open approach to foreign policy, right? But it's an interesting time to be talking about it. I mean, I feel like the last 2 years between Ukraine and Gaza, the US doesn't always show, but then there'll be stories that will come out about the ways in which the US is actually doing the thing the US historically did in the 20th century in terms of really helping the Western world, the democratic world, whatever, figure out its response to things and mediating and brokering and really is playing a leadership role in. I mean, the world's pretty chaotic, but I think there's a lot of ways in which the US is right now back in its not crazy uncle mode. And I don't know. It is interesting to think about us continuing to be perceived as crazy uncle, kind of regardless of what we do or of who's in the chair.
I mean, very, very interesting about the internal and external perceptions, but also, of course, this international question. I mean, Emily, you started raising the question of anti-Semitism a few minutes ago, but we all know that, I mean, there has been anti-Semitism in America going right back to the 1930s. There is this perception of America kind of on World War II being so pro-allies, but actually, if you look at the Jewish Historical Association and other places, there are always displays about the Nazi and fascist movements within the US going right back to the 1920s and 30s. But the last year has really intensified things. Since October the 7th, the stakes are higher, the polarization is higher, the reverberations on campuses, the reverberations generationally. If there was always kind of issues about saying the Jewish vote, because really it was multiple Jewish votes, that seems even more fragmented. So what do you make of the kind of international, particularly the Israel-Gaza impact on on American politics, and then the American impact on Israel-Gaza?
What I would say is that the last year has increased it's increased the salience of the issue of Israel and of anti-Semitism in the American election and in the American political space. And look, just very bluntly speaking, I think that's bad for Democrats because there's more division within the Democratic Party on the issue of Israel, because Harris is perceived as, some in the center or on the right would accuse her of not supporting Israel despite what her stated policy is, because, I mean, Trump is seen as being more supportive, and because there are members of her own party who are horrified about the past year and want it to stop and can't bring themselves to vote for the administration that was in power while this was happening. So I think salience on Israel is not good for the Democratic Party, so it impacts that one way. And I think, we were talking at the beginning about increased polarization. I think that's true for American Jews too. I think there's never been a Jewish voter, there's never been the Jewish vote. But I do think there's been a paradigmatic Jewish voter who's somebody who's, vaguely liberal, vaguely connected to Israel. Anti-Semitism in Israel are not their top issues, but they care about it. And while that's still there still is that voter in many ways, right? We know from polling that the average American Jewish voter is going to vote for the Democrats, for Harris and the Democrats, and the average American voter doesn't care about anti-Semitism or Israel as their top issues. I do think that the differences for American Jews on where they sit on these questions has become much more stark, right? Like, for example, I'm going to read this because I want to make sure I get their name right. In the spring, the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs polled American Jews and found that a third would either strongly agree or agree that Israel was carrying out a genocide. Now, that's not half, that's not 60%, but it's also not 3%, right? Like, there's a third of American Jews who feel this way, and there's no sort of that's a great disparity with people who find that just using the word is anti-Semitic. So it's increased, I would say it's raised the issue within the Democratic Party. It has sort of encouraged further or caused further division between American Jews. I don't know that this paradigmatic American Jewish center is really holding, frankly speaking. And the last thing that I will say, which isn't totally the question you asked, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway, is that I do find it interesting that, so GBAO Strategies also put out a poll, found that 9% of American Jews say that Israel is one of their top two issues. The Forward, we were talking about this before this event, also just recently put out, I would encourage everybody to look it out. It's actually a really interesting set of polls or survey results, and found that, there too, it's democracy, it's abortion, it's healthcare, these are the top concerns for American Jews. And yet I listened in on the Harris Walz call for Jewish voters, and a lot of it was about Iran and about Israel. And I think that there is, I'll just put this out as sort of food for thought, that I sometimes think that the issues that American Jewish mainstream groups talk about, or that politicians speak about when speaking to American Jews, are not actually the issues that the average, sorry, that's my dog, that the average American Jew is really going home and thinking about. Which makes sense, right? Probably if you're running a major American Jewish group, you've been to Israel more times than none, which half of American Jews is true of half of American Jews. So I would say all of that, which partially answers your question and partially is just something that I thought was important to raise.
Okay, well, let's throw that back to Jodi before I bring Josh back in, because you've obviously been responsible for commissioning some of these polls. You're seeing this data all the time. What is your instinct based on your readers' responses?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it seems pretty clear. I mean, even the 9% that GBAO found in terms of where people ranked Israel on their list is, massively higher than it's ever been in an exit poll, where it's usually 1%. And I know people in Israel are always particularly surprised by this idea of why don't American Jews rank Israel high on their list? And it's because we're American Jews. When you go into the polling place, and I always think about this when I look at these exit polls of Jews or of women or of parents or of college educated people, or it's I'm all those things, and I bring all of those identities into the polling booth with me, and it's hard for me to tell you which part of me is voting for what, right? I'm all of me, and I'm all those things. And many people, especially in younger generations, are even more things. People are, mixed race and are whatever. So I think that it's not surprising to me. I mean, and the idea that, so why is Israel and anti-Semitism ranking higher? It's a more active issue. And so the idea that more people are raising that issue, it's been a big issue in our lives, in our news cycle. It's literally a raging war that is you can care about it more than you have before for any number of reasons. I think what kind of bothers me about a lot of the discourse around this is the idea that there's functionally a really big difference between the policies of the two parties on this issue. I mean, there is more open discussion of detractors of Israel to the left calling for an arms embargo, and really right-wing supporters of Israel calling for things like, destroy Gaza or resettle Gaza. But those are really fringe opinions in terms of Washington. Like, people who actually make policy, who sit in governments, who vote for things, there has never been much daylight between Republicans and Democrats on actually what the policy is in Israel, around Israel. And there's really not that much difference in how Trump would literally handle this war versus how Harris would literally handle this war. I do think that Trump's rhetoric around the war, and this really relates to what Josh was saying before, like, if you can take Israel and all your emotions about Israel sort of out of it, this idea of like this view of the world that's like, the Hamas attack wouldn't have happened. Putin's invasion of Ukraine wouldn't have happened if I was president. This is about a world's view versus a policy. It's not really policy, it's like a world's view of what he thinks his role as a world leader, how he thinks the world works. That I think tells you what you need to know. Or I mean, I think that you should react to kind of that, as opposed to, Trump's ability to say, get a bill through Congress that relates to something about US military support for Israel. Like, it's not really, I don't think that the policy differences would be very stark. I do think that the rhetorical differences are really stark. It's different to stand up and say this attack wouldn't have happened versus Harris's statements, which people are parsing and criticizing, which is basically like, I think this is horrible, and I also think this is horrible, and I really believe that everybody's staying there and they need to. So for me, it's a little bit more vibes than there's really like going to be some different change. And I guess the other thing to think about is, it's very clear that Biden has been increasingly harsh with Netanyahu behind closed doors and somewhat in public. You can imagine that Kamala Harris and virtually, I would say, most mainstream politicians in either party would be the same, are very concerned about the specific ways that Netanyahu is handling the prosecution of this war, and handling things in his own country, and handling things in the West Bank. And I think that it's pretty clear that Trump would be very much like this. I want to surround myself with people like Putin and Orban, and Netanyahu can kind of do what he wants. So I think the free reign for Netanyahu thing is real, but I don't know that like it's gonna change how much military aid we send to Israel.
Okay. Well, that's a very, very interesting perspective, that in some level it won't change things. I'm going to ask Josh what his perception is, but just before I do so, this is my kind of final call out to the audience. Please send your questions through if you also want our speakers to address your questions and issue. But Josh, thinking about that internationalism, and from a British perspective, what do you feel like the stakes are, either around Israel or in terms of wider international and foreign policy, or depending on which of Harris or Trump gets elected and which way America goes?
Well, I think Jodi is right when she says that if you cut through the rhetoric and the positioning, there's quite a lot of continuity in American foreign policy. Not on everything, obviously, but take China as a really big issue. The Biden administration hasn't diverged that significantly from the Trump administration's more adversarial stance on China. So, and similarly, support for Israel, military support for Israel, is a central plank of American foreign policy. I don't sense that would change whoever's president. But there are there will be some shifts. I do think if you take Ukraine, for example, I think we're probably heading towards some kind of endgame. Most people seem to think that, people who know more about it than I do. But the nature of the endgame could be different with Trump or Harris. And there's a sense that people fear, certainly in foreign policy circles, that Trump would push Ukraine into a worse deal, that they would have less leverage over Putin, and they would end up in a weaker position. And so, when we look at it from Britain's perspective, I think we have to look at the overall mega trend, which is America pulling back somewhat from its role as global policeman, America wanting more from its NATO allies, from its European allies, America probably focusing or trying to focus more on China and the great geostrategic competition of the 21st century, and trying to get Europe to sort of look after its own borders a little more. That hasn't been a very successful process with war in Ukraine and then war in the Middle East. But if you look at that mega trend, that again the emphasis will shift depending on whether it's Trump or Harris, but the overall direction of travel is quite discernible regardless. And so I think in Britain and in Europe, we are slowly, probably too slowly, coming to terms with the fact that America's role is changing in the world. The kind of post-war consensus has started to crumble, and we need to work out our big decision making over the next decade or two is to work out, or maybe less, if depending on how events play out, is to work out how we fill some of those gaps and how we, bolster our own position, still working with America. I don't think anyone's expecting NATO to, what did Macron call it, go brain dead tomorrow, but it's clearly not brain dead as we've seen in Ukraine. But the overall direction of travel is probably a little bit unsettling, and something that we need to do hard thinking about here, and independent thinking as well.
Could I just jump in? I think I would just say I think the big changes would be, I think Josh is absolutely right on Ukraine. We should not forget that it's not just that there's a trend in the Republican Party that like thinks Putin is good. It's that President Zelensky was involved in Trump's first impeachment, and so far as that impeachment was because Trump was trying to get him to investigate a political rival, and was frustrated that that did not happen, right? So there's like a personal component to all of this as well. And the other things are, I mean, foreign aid, which was a big issue in the first Trump term. And actually, I remember that Britain specifically was sort of saying, hey, could you not make dramatic cuts to foreign aid? This will really hurt the work that all of us are trying to do. And then the third thing is we sometimes don't think of climate change as a foreign policy issue, but it is. And I think that the difference there will be pretty profound at a time when I would hope that we all agree, everybody needs to be working toward tackling the climate crisis. But generally, I think, I mean, this isn't a Jewish issue, it's a foreign policy issue, but yeah, I think I agree with Josh that people have sort of thought like, I don't know about these Americans, like, are they going to be there for us? And I also agree that that's as far as they've gotten in the conversation, right? Like, as far as I've seen and reported on, it's not like they've said, yes, we can't depend on the United States anymore. Jump into this for ourselves and we'll take the reins and we'll, right? Like that part is still missing.
I would say to what Jodi pointed out earlier, it's not like America's gone, absent without leave here. Like, the supply of arms to Ukraine and Israel has been considerable, and the strategic support to Taiwan behind the scenes is still there too, although it's more ambiguous. But there is just this sense again of America's will perhaps faltering, but also the sense that actually if it is going to focus on China, then there's just so many competitions and fronts in which it can be the leader, in which it can supply all the weapon, the major weaponry, and underwrite all the funding, and there is just a limit to America's will and ability to do that.
Okay, thank you so much. But let's move slightly. So we've talked about the foreign policy. Let's move back to the domestic realm. I'm going to take the word climate in a different direction. Professor Joe Goldblatt, who is zooming in from Scotland, but describes himself as one of the crazy American uncles Josh describes. So we might get Joe on a little bit later. Points out the kind of divisiveness within the USA. And he said, the Cold War and McCarthyism lasted 12 years and only ended with his trial and death. But, how long is this going to go on? How much longer is this current McCarthyism going to be for? And he's referring to the kinds of free speech issues. So on the one hand, we have questions around anti-Semitism, but on the other, the responses to them includes, how do you deal with demonstrations? There's all this rhetoric about the enemy within. So, like, what is your perception? Are we in a currently new McCarthy world, Jodi?
Um, my perception is bad. No, it's bad. It's really, really depressing and bad. The discourse has devolved to a kind of base level that is depressing and embarrassing, and I'm really, really concerned about the ability to repair it. And there are bad actors all over the place. There are certainly bad actors across the political spectrum who are equally, I mean, actually, I take the word equally back. People are constantly like, how can you equate blah, blah, blah? And it's like, it seems to me like, why even bother trying to measure like one terrible thing that's totally beyond the pale versus another? But there are very bad people, bad actors who are saying outrageous, dehumanizing thing from the left and from the right. There are then like institutional bad actors. The tech companies are like not helping this. And as I said earlier, there are just fewer and fewer spaces where people are expected to talk across difference, to engage across difference. Um, I recently did a book talk with Josh Leifer, who wrote this book about, now I'm forgetting what it's actually called. It's called Tablets Shattered, about, the sort of fraught last century of American Jewry. And he says at the very end of the book that he prefers to pray with people he disagrees with. But even our synagogues are like, fewer and fewer of them are places where people actually have different opinions. I live in a town that we make fun of as calling it the People's Republic of Montclair, and it's a place where, you know, people on Halloween like throw eggs at the lone Trump sign that somebody is willing to put out. There's not respect. There's diversity on campuses. There's respect for every kind of diversity except diversity of political thought. There's very little tolerance at elite universities for conservatives. Um, and there's now this kind of complete outcry and outrage about, supposed lack of safety on college campuses for Jewish students. But the number of Jewish students who've actually been threatened or attacked or physically harmed is minuscule. And what's actually happening is a lot of people are uncomfortable on campus. And frankly, that's exactly what they should be. Campuses are meant to be a place where you're confronted with things that are uncomfortable. You're away from this cocoon that you grew up in and your family and your community, probably more like-minded, and you're thrust into a place where not only are people very different from you, but the whole idea is to explore challenging concepts and ideas, to learn things that like scare you or maybe like surprise you. And instead, we've created this like idea that everybody should be comfortable all the time. And I don't think we should be comfortable all the time, but I also don't think we should be attacked and dehumanized and have the most vile things said about politicians or their supporters all the time. So I forget what the question was. Sorry, I went down a little bit of a rant, but it's a bad situation. How can we repair it? I think maybe was one of the questions.
How long will it last, I think?
How long will it last? Yeah, I don't know how long it will last, and I do think it depends a lot on the outcome. And I think, I mean, at the risk of sounding completely self-serving, I will sound completely self-serving, which is I do think one way of repairing it is to support independent journalism outlets that are committed to the idea of a 360-degree view of complex situations, reporting thoroughly from all sides, and to opinion platforms that actually try to platform all the perspectives and to get people to read them, not in a I'm reading this because I disagree or hate you, but just in a like, oh, I never thought of it that way kind of way. So I don't think that will solve all of our problems, but I think a healthy independent media is a critical pillar of democracy, and one of the things that we've lost significant ground on and that we are truly in danger of collapsing.
Okay, amazing answer, Jodi, but also the perfect segue into one of our other questions.
I mean, I love that.
You're talking about the independent media and what it means to do opinion and news reporting. And actually, I'm going to ask the other two first before I come back to you, but it was you who triggered this question. So we have Susan in our Zoom audience who's zooming in from the New York Times, from New York. And she said, you mentioned earlier being friendly with the politics editor of the New York Times. And one of the things the New York Times has been facing in the last few years is what is the line between news reporting and opinion? And that has got more and more fuzzy, and there's been a lot of debate around it, both by New York Times journalists and former New York Times journalists, as well as readers. So for you as reporters, how is reporting on this election different from living through it? And what is that line between opinion and news, and how do you handle it? Josh, shall we start with you?
Yeah, just before I answer that, I would just point out something we observe a lot in the UK at the moment, which is the average salary in Mississippi, the poorest state in America, is now higher than the average salary in Britain and indeed most of Europe, I think. So, um,
Wow.
although we look on your political discourse with dismay, we look at your economy with great envy. So, there's some good news there.
To tell
Um,
that to our voters.
yeah.
Good to say.
I mean, the cover of The Economist this week was America's economic miracle. I mean, that's how the rest of the world is looking at America if they're thinking about the economy. But in terms of your question about journalism, I was always quite lucky to be a foreign correspondent at the Sunday Times, where British journalism doesn't have this very, very rigid Chinese wall between opinion and reporting and news reporting. Obviously, there's a distinction, but as a foreign correspondent, I sort of blended the two. I used to do kind of more reportage, and I never had to grapple with this. I always looked on at the American newspapers and their kind of holy vision of themselves as sort of lantern bearers of the First Amendment, and found it a bit odd, frankly, because in Britain we see ourselves as kind of hacks, and we sort of know that everyone's a bit biased and opinionated. And I think that I remember Peter Baker at the New York Times. I don't know if that's who you were referencing earlier, Jodi, but he once said that he doesn't vote in elections because he thinks he should be a sort of Jupiterian kind of figure who's sort of glides past all that. I found that very odd, frankly. Nothing against him personally, but I just found that a very odd way to think of yourself as not somehow not a participant in society as well as a reporter on it. So, in a way, what I've seen develop in American journalism to me seems like a more honest reflection of what reporting truly is, which is it's not objective, but it's an attempt to be reasonable and fair-minded and accurate. And beyond that, you know, you can't ever achieve true objectivity. I think in Britain newspapers have clear agendas, so you sort of to some extent expect different positions depending on your newspaper. The problem with the New York Times, I always felt, was that of course it had an agenda. We know that it does, but it was kind of pretending not to, and I always found that a bit odd. So I don't like activist reporting a lot of the time, but I do think that there is in a funny way more honesty about how reporters go about their business now than there was 10, 20 years ago. But Jodi and Emily may have more informed and different views to that.
Let's ask them. Emily.
Well, I would say, okay, so personally, I do opinion writing and what I would call reported analysis and more straight news. So I jump over the lines. I'm a freelance journalist, so sort of for professional necessity, I end up doing all of it. And I think for me, the question is whatever I'm writing grounded in something, right? Have I talked to people? Is this an informed view? Is this about transparency and accountability? So that's what I try to use for myself. Obviously, if I were on a news team at the Wall Street Journal, that would not fly. I think the problem, though, zooming out from my favorite subject myself, the problem that many reporters are facing now is that how can you be objective and be nonpartisan when one of our two major presidential candidates is talking about people who don't vote for him as enemies of the people who should maybe be deported, right? Like, how do you say that and not sound like you're a Democratic Party stooge? But that's what he's saying. So how can you not say it, right? And so I just think that one of the challenges that we're having right now is that if you use objectivity and calling balls and strikes and seeing both sides is really, you are holding them both to account, you actually can't do that if you don't report on the fact that one of these, like, that they're not the same right now. One party, the leader of one party encouraged people to go to the Capitol on January 6th. The other party did not do that. There's a fundamental mismatch. Like, I can hear myself saying this and I sound like a Democratic Party stooge, right? But but I'm also just describing reality. So I think that's a challenge that we're facing in people who are trying to describe the world accurately, the country accurately and fairly right now.
Wow, okay. So that asymmetry puts kind of pressure on you, because do you reflect it with asymmetrical reporting?
Exactly.
Or so Jodi, I'm going to come back to you. You've already talked about a little bit about what you do at the Forward, and we'd love to hear more. But I want to add one other question to that. So Rebecca in our audience has asked if you can talk a little bit about the demographic divide we're hearing about between younger Jews and their parents over Gaza, but also guns, environment, abortion. You know, is this generational divide kind of something that you address within your reporting? And what do you see as this kind of, particularly Gaza's impact on political allegiances on the Jewish community?
Yeah, I'll definitely get there. I do want to just respond a little bit to what Josh says or react to it. I mean, I think that it's not so much I've sort of dropped the word objective in how I think about this. I do think obviously people are subjective and they bring their humanity and their perspective and their experience alongside them with their reporting when they report. And I think that one of the really great advents of digital versus sort of the old-fashioned newspaper is bringing more humanity of individual reporters and perspective to the work, using the first person more, using the experience of reporting. But I think the real question and the thing I try to focus on is neutrality. And I think it's really about the neutrality of the outcome, not the neutrality of as Emily said, how you characterize things. So it's like there is a kind of journalism often practiced in Britain as well as Israel, and in more advocacy organizations here, where the stories are framed in a way that has to do with like, we are these kind of people who believe this kind of thing and want this kind of candidate to succeed. And so we pick and choose our stories to build arguments that will have that outcome. And independent journalism, or the kind of journalism that I practice at the New York Times and at the Forward, it doesn't do that. I mean, the hardcore difference between opinion and reporting is really like you're making an argument versus you're observing what's going on and analyzing it and contextualizing it. But I do think that it really, to me, has to do with, are you trying to affect an outcome, and are you deciding on the front end, like what to do and how to do it based on how you want the story to come out? Or are you going into something with an open mind, a big question that you don't know the answer to, and following the story where it takes you? And like thinking about, I mean, Peter was not who I was talking about, but we were good friends as well. He followed me as Jerusalem bureau chief for a brief time, and I was his editor after that. And I mean, I have voted in some elections. I didn't vote in the one that I covered in 2004 that I covered day to day. So I do get what he's talking about. And the issue is not like, are you a participant in society or an observer of it? It's like what you are doing by covering an election for the New York Times or covering the White House for the New York Times is like so much bigger in terms of the impact than an individual vote. And you just want to like, it's just about perception of neutrality. I mean, I don't have a problem with reporters like Peter voting, but I do get why you say like it's okay. The other thing is that many of us live in places where our vote doesn't matter at all because of the way our electoral system works. So, the idea that Peter, who lives in Washington, D.C., or I, who have lived in New York and New Jersey and Chicago, would decide not to like vote in an election is you're not really giving up very much. It's a little different than if you were voting in a swing district. So, anyway, back to Rebecca's question about the generational divide. I think that there is a profound generational divide among American Jews over Israel, over the war in Gaza, and I would say over, to some extent, what it means to be Jewish, what Jewish identity is all about. And I'll get back to that in a second, because I first want to say I don't really think there is a huge generational divide among Jews over guns and abortion, and I think climate was the other thing you said. I mean, young people in America are certainly more concerned about climate than older people, but the vast majority of American Jews, somewhere in the 70s%, are liberal, on domestic issues, liberal, democratic, they are pro-choice, they are for gun control, and they are generally concerned about the environment. And I think, it may be that the younger generation is like more liberal. Young people, while they're young, generally are more liberal, but I don't think this is like a real change in terms of generational divide. I will say that, but there is a huge generational divide over the role Israel plays in their lives, and also about how people think about their Jewish identity. And I think that's mainly about, Gen Z and younger millennials take a very fluid approach to all questions of identity. I think their understanding of gender and sexuality is actually, and which I think some of us olds are like starting to get and understand more, actually applies to other parts of their lives. Like, so a lot of them are Jewish and something else. Maybe that's another religion, maybe that's another race. Maybe that's about their identity as queer or as something. I mean, they're more comfortable with the multiplicities of identities than people in my generation, Generation X, or older generations. And I think that particularly post October 7th, a lot of Gen Z's parents, people like me, and people older than me, like they've like hardened up their Jewishness and their Jewish identity. They're like, this thing has become more important to me. And again, they think of it more as like, my Jewish identity is like, that's all I can hold right now, right? And I think there are many young Jews who also have gotten more interested in their Jewishness post October 7th, but they're holding it all with other things. And one of the biggest takeaways for me from this year of, a lot of intense journalism surrounded by a lot of intense emotion, I would say we have 5 different stories, columns really, about like how to talk about Israel across generations, or how to talk about Israel with someone who disagrees with you. They always get a zillion readers, all of them. People are deeply troubled by this divide. They do not understand its components, although I do and can explain them to you. No, I'm just kidding. But like, I think they're not actually that unclear, but people are torn apart by this idea that their children and grandchildren feel so profoundly differently than they do about something that is so core to their identity. And sometimes they don't believe it's real. Sometimes they define them out of being Jewish or whatever. But this is a big, big problem in American Jewish families and also American Jewish organizations. I will say one little caveat before, I'm sorry to go on so long, but there's an exception to all of this, right? Which is the Orthodox, which is a growing percentage of American Jews. And there is less, I think there are many things that are dividing generations of Orthodox Jews, including things like around sexuality. But Israel is less of a clear divider in that part of our community than in the rest of it.
Thank you. Emily.
Could I just say one thing, which is that sometimes when I am on panels or talks where this question comes up, someone will ask, are young Jews just trying to fit in with their progressive peers? And what I will say is maybe, which like that wouldn't be new for American Jews, right? We built synagogues in the post-war period to fit in a different way. But I also think it's sort of dismissive to say, well, they're just trying to fit in with their friends, right? I think it doesn't take seriously the children that you raised, the history that shaped them, which for most of them was like maybe they were sort of alive for Oslo, but basically it's been post Oslo, right? So they've only seen this get worse. And also, they listened to you when you gave them these good liberal values. And now they're applying it to this too and drawing a conclusion that's different from you. I think for older generations, you can sort of stack American liberal Zionists neatly on top of one another. And I think for younger Jews, that's less true. That doesn't mean that they weren't paying attention when you were speaking. It's just that they've heard the words and done something different with them than maybe their parents or grandparents wanted. So I think, I just think that, in the same way that the younger generation should take seriously the history that their parents and grandparents lived through and are referring to and the conclusions that they've drawn, it's also, first of all, it's just baseline respectful, but it's also if you want to try to find a solution or some commonality, it's really important to take seriously the history that the millennials and especially Gen Z and younger have lived through, and how they came to that conclusion, even if you disagree with it.
Absolutely. And I've seen a lot of reporting just very, very recently going, how much of this is a response to the pandemic as well, which is not something we think about. But, every meal, every Shabbos and Yom Tov meal I've been at in the last 2 weeks, which has been mixed generational, kind of young students have been talking about how profoundly that impacted their sense of alienation, their sense of community, their response to their peers, their response to institutions, and then taking that out more widely to political opinions. So I think there's going to be a lot of think pieces and thinking around this for a long time to come. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left. And so one more question, one more brief question to you all. And I'm going to use this opportunity actually to advertise to my audience what JR is doing next. So next Tuesday, we're not on Zoom, we're in person. At the Marylebone Theatre in the West End of London, Nathan Englander's play, What Do We Talk About When We Talk About Anne Frank, is on. We have a special trip for Jewish Renaissance subscribers and friends and supporters. We have the best seats in the house, and I'm going to be in conversation with Joshua Molina, who is the lead actor, afterwards. And by the way, if you want to know more about it, there's an interview with Joshua Molina, Nathan Englander, and the director Patrick Marber in our current issue. So many of us know Josh Molina from The West Wing and from his podcast about The West Wing. And the question that he and his co-podcasters always asked was, what's next? So that's my question.
Okay. Okay.
What's Josh?
Well, I think we
So what we're sending hang on, I just got another message from Patrick.
Sorry.
There we
that was someone else had an answer. I think I can't. Our crazed Jewish uncle earlier asked when this will end, which I think is in a way a different way of asking the same question. What's next? I mean, frankly, I think the answer is we don't know. But the reason we don't know is, I think, because underpinning a lot of this turbulence is shifting geopolitics, as we talked about earlier, with terms of America's role in the world and all of that, but B, just the technological acceleration and the transformation of our lives by technology, by social media platforms, by our smartphones, and increasingly by artificial intelligence and capable machines. And we don't know we're in the middle of a technological revolution. No one knows where revolutions end. They just know that they're happening. And so where does AI take us? Is it overhyped? Is it utterly transformational? What will that do to our politics? I just think, when we talk about generational divides, how much of that is due to the way kids are immersed in different social media platforms, the way their algorithms are driving the content that they consume and who they interact with. I just think that is underneath a lot of this turbulence, a lot of what we talked about is that fundamental transformation that's happening, and we don't know where it's taking us. The agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, these reshaped the world for centuries afterwards, forever, really. So we may be in a similar time to that, and it may be 200 years before people can see the real contours of what has changed at the moment. I don't know if that's very optimistic, but I just think it's sort of pragmatic. I think sometimes I just feel like I have to sort of just, when you go on a really steep water slide and you just kind of sit back and kind of let it happen to you. I think sometimes that's how I feel about the world at the moment. I'm sort of in history again, and I just kind of have to, go down the log flume and see what happens.
Okay, that was the great reporter's response and the macro's response, but not nailing your colours to the mast at
Oh,
all.
what, on the election? I mean, it's a coin toss, right? We all know, anyone who tells you otherwise is telling you something. I mean, Trump seems to be marginally ahead with a bit of momentum this week, but do we trust the polling to be that exact? No. So it's close.
Emily, it's close. What happens either way if Trump wins or if Kamala Harris wins?
I am not going to answer that because I cannot know. I think I am not going to predict what happens if either candidate wins. I do think that the idea that I think that it will be pretty disruptive to American domestic society, certainly if Trump wins this election. And I think if Kamala wins, I think it'll also be really hard. Obviously, this is a very divided country. People are really unhappy. I think the Democratic Party has a lot of soul searching to do, whether or not she wins or loses. But I think that will be easier to do if she is president. What happens next? Look, I once read this analysis of the play The Cherry Orchard, and it said, life in the future may not be better, but it will be different. And I think that's what's next, right? I think that one way or another, the fever is going to break, and what's on the other side, we don't know yet.
Thank you. Anything optimistic, Jodi?
Well, first of all, I love The West Wing, so I always love you bringing that in. Everything I learned about politics, I learned from Jed Bartlett. Look, I think that, I mean, one of the things, riffing off what Josh said, I was struck last week. I read a column by, I can't remember if it was Nate Cohn or Nate Silver, the world's two biggest American polling experts, but like, they were basically like, what we're focused on now is understanding which way the polls are likeliest to be wrong based on how they've been wrong before. And it's like, okay, if this is what it's gotten to, I think Josh is right to stop reading them. Like, we have no idea what's going to happen on 2 weeks from today. Really, nobody has any idea. And it's not going to be resolved 2 weeks from today. But I think, I don't know if this is optimistic or not, but one of the ways that my boss and I at the Forward talk about and think about digital innovation is, and in the news space, but I think it applies to other spaces as well, is that it's not like you have to master the latest technology. You have to master TikTok or Facebook or video or podcasts. What you have to master is being ready for whatever comes next and being adaptable and being able to be clear about what are your values and understand that they can be expressed on any platform or in any medium, and you can, pivot and adapt. So I think what's next is tumult and change, for sure. I do think, I mean, it's hard to imagine two presidential candidates who have a bigger difference, not only in a vision of the country, but in sort of how they would represent the country. I mean, I think that there are some ways in which we don't pay enough attention to the idea that you could have the first woman of color being president of the United States. And that's a very, very significant moment in terms of what's next in ways that I don't even know. And certainly we've talked already about the ways in which Donald Trump would be a different kind of president, not only than we've ever had before, but even than he was in his first term. So I do think that we are in for a very different 4 years based on whichever one of them wins. And that, I mean, it's also true that, like, I don't know. When I was covering the 2004 election, one of my mentors, Adam Nagurney, gave me one piece of advice. He's like, what you're trying to do is just explain how the guy will make decisions, who he's going to put around him and how he makes decisions, because the policy stuff doesn't really matter, because when 9/11 happened, like, the question of how George Bush was going to react to 9/11 was based on, like, how does he react to crisis? Who's around him? How does he make decisions? It wasn't based on anything he'd said in the campaign. You can't anticipate what you're going to be faced with. And, like, nobody could have anticipated the Hamas attack. Nobody could have anticipated the extent of the devastation in Gaza. Like, we don't know what we're going to have to deal with. So the question is much more one of character and decision making and who they put around them. And so in that way, I guess how I'm thinking about it is, whatever's next will, not only they, but really we, be sort of prepared to evolve our ways of doing what we do, but hold fast to our values about how we do what we do, with integrity, and therefore be able to handle whatever's next. So I'm sure that Josh and Emily will be able to do that, and Jewish Renaissance as well.
Thank you, and amen. Like, I really hope that that is what will happen, and integrity is the one thing we can hold on to. Thank you so much. I'm sure everyone's going to, in the audience, will agree that it's been a fantastic program. And I do hope that we'll have all of you back at some point in the future once we know what happens next. I'm going to bring in our program producer, Emma, who put tonight together, because I want to say thank you to her, but I know she wants to do a proper thank you to all of you and also just give everybody a little bit of insight into what is coming over the next few weeks as part of This American Jewish Life. Emma.
So as Aviva said, I want to thank all three of you for giving up your time today, and for such insightful analysis from all of you. I think there is so much noise around this election. Certainly, you know, when it reaches us in the UK, it feels like noise. And to have an hour of, you know, such thoughtful commentary and conversation between all of you is, you know, really a privilege for us to be able to host that. So thank you. And this event was part of our new series called This American Jewish Life, which will be continued after the election. So we will be in the next by the next time we meet, and that will be for a focus on Philadelphia, which was the passport section of our latest issue. So we'll be hearing from some of our Philadelphia contributors, and then the series will continue with some historical and literary perspectives on American Jewish life in this moment in 2024. And we also have 3 in-person trips in London. As Aviva mentioned, we have tickets left for what we talk about when we talk about Anne Frank, which is next week. And we have a special discount available for under 35s, which you can see if you follow the link that I posted. And we have some tickets remaining for another theatre trip to see Giant at the Royal Court. And we're also...
It's really good, by the way. Just
yes, I have heard it's really, really good. So
really good.
and it is sold out. So the only way to see it is with us. So I think there's like
We're
40
in conversation after the event with the writer and with some of the actors.
Fantastic.
And we're also going to have a private tour of the new exhibition at the Freud Museum in November, which is completely different, a switch from these events, and we'll be looking at Freud's relationship with women in his life. So yes, all of that to look forward to. I'm just going to post the general events link in the chat, and I will also be sending that out to everybody who booked. So yeah, if you would like to join us for any of those future events, we would love to see you there. And thanks again to all of our panelists tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
And huge thank you, Jodi, Emily, Josh, to all of you, our audience. And at this point, just before we go into Shmini Atzeres, for the customary great greeting is Moadim L'Simcha, may we increase in joy. And I hope that whatever's next, that a little bit of joy will not go amiss.
Yeah.
Bravo!
Evening.
Bravo!
Bye.
Bye.